Hello, very beautiful community. The tyrant in the Kremlin is having a problem with Crimea. So we're going to talk about it. Pictorially, what does it look like? There are fuel shortages. People are economizing, saving, thinking about what trips they can make, what trips they should save on. The motorways are often relatively empty. Bits of the public transport system are not working consistently. People are having problems with electricity. People are having problems with water supply. Shops have generators. People have generators too. But there's a problem with the diesel that's needed to power them. People are talking about shortages of goods in shops. Folks are talking about sugar not being readily available. People are talking about the terminals for payment not being powered in shops, so going to a shop and not being able to buy what you need. Children's camps are suspended for the summer, including the famous Artek camp that really speaks to the significance of Crimea, not just for the Putin regime, but also during the Soviet period. It's an image, this Artek camp is an image associated with Crimea evocatively for people with Soviet memory. In the Soviet Union, if you had some good access at work or a bit of cultural capital, in the summers you might go either to the Baltics or to Crimea on holiday. People are hearing thuds and explosions in the distance. People who have properties in Crimea that they use for the summer are quite inclined to go because they've got a place there. But people who have no special reason to go are very disinclined to go, but still some are going, which is an extraordinary expression of a kind of routinized depoliticization. I actually think we should pick one of these people and look at their psychology. What psychology do you need to have to go to Crimea when you have no need to go to Crimea as your holiday destination? Part of how people get there is they think, well, I don't actually know what the truth about anything is, so I'm not going to know what it's like there till I get there. Post-truth holidaying. Obviously, the tourist industry is in real trouble, and beaches are relatively empty. So how do people feel about this? I think it's important to understand that there is going to be a deep and depoliticized preoccupation with the material. We've got electricity, we've got water. Have you got water? Have you got electricity? Or did you drive your kids somewhere? Well, we didn't, because actually we didn't feel we had enough fuel. And how does tomorrow look? Well, it looks like we can manage it, but my small business is doing really bad. I might go bankrupt. Tomorrow, next week. So all of these fears and stresses about this kind of state of quarter collapse of state capacity in Crimea and deep disruption to civilian life. And then the fear that fear will perpetuate. So what a lot of folks, as far as I can observe, and it's very important that I am not a Crimea specialist, I have an enormous knowledge of Russian politics and Russian culture, but there are Crimean experts. I am not one of them. Obviously, I'm a political philosopher. So what we're doing is painting for the benefit of understanding what's going on, a kind of semi-cartoonish box, so that we can kind of put a few basic things into it and then refer to them to give us a sense of the big picture. So people are feeling fearful, and people are feeling fearful that the reasons to be fearful will perpetuate into the future because there is no dynamic of progress. So this is a problem, that's a problem. Is this actually getting better? And does the Putin regime even have a capacity to make any of this go better? And then you've got the Ukrainian info-war machinery saying that they're actually going to make Crimea into an island. Well, that doesn't sound good. But I don't see what Putin can do to start making this better. So this is not good. At the same time, be very slow about anticipating that this will convert into politicization. Certain questions are absolutely available to people in Crimea because they're human and they have a modicum of rationality and they are similarly motivated to all of us because they're human. And so they will have thoughts like, yeah, I was here before 2014, as the majority of folks in Crimea were. Isn't this worse? Haven't we got a bad deal here? And people who are new to Crimea, who moved after 2014, might think, well, did we come for this? Right? And yes, Crimea has gone through all kinds of strange states of war and instability, but let's say, is this situation better than the situation in 1916, when Crimea was still a holiday destination, but Russia was in really the last months of Tsardom. Russia was losing a world war. Well, 2026 might be a less stable. Historians can answer this for us. Might be a less stable time slice to be in Crimea even in 2016. So this is not pretty. But don't expect that this gets converted into political sentiment questioning the legitimacy of the Putin regime very easily. It's mostly going to be devoid of agency. So this is a tense situation, and we don't know who even started this war. These are just tensions between states. God knows what they're about. How do I know what Putin is thinking or why this thing started, right? And the same kind of absence of agency will be directed to Ukrainian weaponry, Ukrainian drones flying over Crimea. This stuff is flying, this stuff is striking stuff, this stuff is causing explosions. And it's very important not to overgeneralize from social media videos unless you already have deep knowledge of the place independently of the social media videos. That's the paradox with social media videos of Russia. They are useful, but to understand them, you need to have independent of social media knowledge of Russia. Otherwise, you can get sort of lost and they can misrepresent the picture. But people are talking in very passive terms about what's happening. Well, stuff's flying around, stuff's crashing, stuff's exploding. Well, who's firing that stuff? It's just flying by itself, is it? And why are they firing that stuff? Could it be because they got attacked by an aggressive empire? Yeah. Now, of course, in Crimea, there's a very big minority demographic of Crimean Tatars, a repressed group. And even outside of that group, there are still going to be some people who are overtly pro-Ukraine, but cumulatively overtly pro-Ukraine people are going to be a minority in Crimea. Then there's going to be a bigger group who's beginning to have a kind of depoliticized exasperation about the war. What is this stuff happening? Can it stop? I wish it wasn't happening. As we're on this topic, let me give you a quick kernel about how to resist Russian propaganda on Crimea. Because it's very important that Russia's acquisition of Crimea can't be really recognized by us as legitimate, even if Russia's account of how it happened were true when it isn't. That's to say, imagine there were a completely independent and free vote in Crimea about which country you want to belong to. It still would not be intelligible to us at the level of legitimacy, because such a process would always need to happen in two stages for us to make sense of it legitimacy-wise. If Norfolk, UK, wanted to join Denmark, it would need to secede first and then join Denmark in two steps. If you are married, you would need to divorce and then marry again, right? So even if it's true, and it's not implausible that that was true, that the majority of people in Crimea would have preferred Russia over Ukraine in 2014, that doesn't make the annexation legitimate. Now, back to impact of all of this on the Putin regime. Now, of course, historically, we've raised the question of what are the chances of Ukraine actually taking Crimea. And I've always been very pessimistic about that. In other words, I remember first time somebody asked me about it 3 or 4 years ago, what are the odds, Vlad? And I said about 5%, because the odds of Ukraine taking Crimea are essentially the same as the odds of Russia collapsing. However, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is Ukraine being progressively able to cut Crimea off from the supplies it needs and disrupt it without acquiring it. And here we have got a problem, right? The Ukrainian info war machine is saying that Crimea is going to become an island. And of course, this is a matter of degrees. But the trouble is that the population has a point when it doesn't see a clear dynamic for what Putin can do to make the situation considerably better. And what we've got to understand here is that Russia keeping Crimea, but things going progressively worse and visibly worse for Crimea, is actually damaging to the Putin regime the way it wouldn't be damaging if it were happening in another part of Russia. Because Crimea is actually an exception to Russia's conception of its own imperial space as borderless. Right? When Ukraine invaded the Kursk Oblast, we made a couple of videos on the main channel about Russia's borderlessness. And one of the observations we made is that while, of course, people there were hugely impacted by what's happened, if there were no deleterious impact and somebody could wave a magic wand and say, hey, we're going to make your life 5% better, but the difference is now Ukraine will run you instead of Russia, you're going to take the deal. A lot of people just say, yeah, why the hell not? And that's because of this state of borderlessness that's expressed in Russians feeling that they don't share a country with fellow citizens, but that they live on a population that happens to be one with particular borders and run by a particular authority. So it's a colonial relationship that much of the Russian population has with its own authority. What's the Kremlin to you? Well, we live on this territory and we pay taxes here and do other things, blah, 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 and there's some rules we follow, and these are the guys who are running us, but we don't know exactly what they're doing. We don't know why they're making the decisions we're making. It's not in our interest for them to make a total disaster of their decisions, so we hope they're making good decisions, but we can't know, actually, what motivates them, what they're up to. So fingers crossed they don't make too much of a mess of things and we'll get on with our private lives. And Putin in 2022 was gambling that Ukrainians would have the same relationship with their own state, but they didn't. But an exception to this state of borderlessness is Crimea. It is a common arrangement in authoritarian regimes that people sacrifice their public freedom in exchange for keeping their private freedom. Right? Stay out of politics, but in exchange you can buy whatever you can afford, you can travel wherever you want. Now that sort of arrangement was indeed destabilized for Russians when Putin full-scale invaded Ukraine, but there is still the sense that that arrangement is kind of still sufficiently available or sufficiently restorable, even if it looks fractured for the moment. Some of these thoughts are delusions of a normalizing kind. But there is another kind of arrangement, and that arrangement is to do with dusting off imperial glory and engaging a little bit in the acquisition and gathering of lands to re-enchant Russia's imperial greatness. And so that sort of arrangement is about, we're going to have to make some sacrifices, but look, we've got Crimea. And look, we've got Crimea is a central part of the sacralization that is available to the Putin regime. Sacralization of Putin as a monarch. Monarchism is a central ideology in the contemporary world. Trump is an exponent of it. Putin is a much more extreme exponent of it. But this is the idea that Putin is the only institution in town with perceived legitimacy. A source of that legitimacy is Crimea and his acquisition of Crimea. And so it's way more damaging for Putin if Crimea looks to be really rocky than if another part of the country looks really rocky. Not because there is going to be a politicization whereby people say, we've had enough, now stop the war, but because the perception of things going badly in Crimea does translate into a kind of radioactive, a kind of corrosive impact on sort of Putin's self-directed myth-making about why his fate should be fused with the cultural fate of Russia. And of course there are many broader thoughts to have here, thoughts about how Crimea was a symbol of luxury and access to Mediterranean culture in the Soviet Union. There are mythical images about how Crimea ties Russia's historical destiny to the ancient Greek world in ways that are allegedly stronger than the ties the West itself has to the ancient Greek world. And the terminus of that thought is that once you think about it properly, Russia is a more Western country than the West itself, blah, blah, blah. And we explored all of this for people who are new to me 2 or 3 years ago in a major video on the main channel, which is one of the most popular videos there, about Russia's extraordinary cultural myths around Crimea and about why Putin, A, can't afford to lose Crimea, but B, would be damaged by really bad things visibly happening there. I'm going to drop that video here for people who are new to me and haven't seen it. Of course, what we've left out here is talk about the military and strategic significance of what's happening, but I wanted to keep that out for a separate conversation. Lots and lots of love. Bye-bye.